Welcome to the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I'm Gary Caton in Waynesville, North Carolina. You can find me on the web at dreamastrologer.com. And today is Wednesday, May 20th. So it's Hermes Day, Mercury Day, and Mercury hour, the first hour after sunrise, belongs to the planet of the day. And Mercury is rising in Gemini. So, wow, that's a powerful combination. That's really what we look for in order to do magical work. Now, Mercury is applying to a square to Neptune and a conjunction to retrograde Venus. So, not going to be doing talismans today. But it would still be a great time to propitiate Mercury, propitiation, prayer, petitions. And it's a great time to talk about Mercury as well. So I want to talk about the archetype of Gemini because, there's a lot of talk about Capricorn and, last year and then again this year. And a lot of these heavy hitters often get a lot of the attention. But we tend to maybe forget about some of the faster moving planets and the archetypes that they're activating. And right now, this conjunction of Mercury with Venus is visible in the western sky at dusk. And it's going to be one of the closest conjunctions that we have for the entire year. So this is not a minor thing at all. And while it is true that it's relatively quick and ephemeral, sometimes Mercury and Venus come together and they're both traveling in the same direction, and they kind of travel along together. And you can have a Mercury-Venus conjunction that lasts weeks. In fact, this one's only going to be a matter of days, but I don't think that makes it less important. It just makes it more focused. So yeah, Mercury made an appearance in the western sky at dusk about a week ago, and we'll talk more about that. Now and Venus was already up very high, and now they're coming together because Venus is retrograde. She's going this way. She's going down. Mercury's coming up, and pretty soon they're going to be joined by the moon. And we'll have a triple conjunction this weekend of those three visible planets in the western sky at dusk. So that should be pretty awesome. But yeah, I wanted to talk about Gemini because, in general, Venus retrograde is activating Gemini, Mercury's going through there. And so what is Gemini all about, and what kind of things can we be looking for, and what should we expect and look for and strive for when there's a notable thing happening in Gemini? Because Gemini is the sign where the transits of Venus occurred in 2012 and 2008. So this is a sign that has been very much activated for our time, for our epoch, if you will. And now it's being reactivated. I thought it'd be a good idea to go over that. And recently, last week, I was a guest on a podcast called The Basement Astrologer with Mr. Kip Dubois, who happened to be he happened to know an old friend of mine, Kelly Lee Phipps, and he wanted to talk about Kelly and stuff, and so we did that for a while, and that was really cool. It was great to remember an old friend and remember his work. And I want to share with you when Kelly passed into whatever next dimensions that cat is traveling around in, he left behind some really fascinating work that was unfortunately unfinished. But his mother and son were kind enough to make that available to the public. And in fact, you can download it for free. She uploaded it to a group called Kelly's Journey on Facebook, and I've got the URL right down here. But he was working on a manuscript that he called the Tao of Astrology, and it, it's a really interesting mix of classical philosophy of all kinds, including Taoism, and also modern astrology ideas like it's kind of evolutionary astrology in a way, in that what he's saying is that the experience of Gemini happens in stages. That there's that as you learn about Gemini, it matures, and the archetype matures and transforms, and that so that there's different expressions when you're just getting familiar with it, and then as you get more familiar with it, that experience grows. And so he had 5 stages. He used the 5 elements of the Eastern elements as, and these are seen as steps or stages of growth. So he goes from the trickster through the shapeshifter, the messenger, storyteller, and then the eternal youth. And it's really fascinating because when I'm working on volume 2 of my book, my series, Hermetica Triptycha, and I've done a ton of research looking into different phases of Mercury. So right now, as I said, Mercury has just made an appearance in the evening sky, right? And so I went through the Astro Databank and I looked at all the people who have that phase of Mercury in their chart, and then I looked at all the people who have that phase of Mercury in their chart, and it's in Gemini, and then I did it by house too. So I spent like an entire year or more doing that research. So I went back to my notebooks and I was like, okay, right now we have Mercury, evening star, just coming into the sky as evening star in Gemini. Who in my research has that placement? And a couple people that popped out, Bob Dylan. And it's fascinating because with public figures, you know, we get to see them grow and transform. And obviously, it's really interesting when Dylan came on the scene. You know, he came on the scene as kind of a protest singer. So this trickster, this idea of the trickster, you know, bringing something new, some new idea, something that needs to change, right? And then becoming the shapeshifter in terms of, going from folk music to rock and roll, right? And everybody was upset about that. And then settled into a phase where he just became like you know, a real professional. I've seen him say that, you know, he had to learn to do consciously what he was doing unconsciously before. So he was just spitting out these rhymes and these words, and it was all beautiful, but it was just flowed out of him. And he had to learn the actual craft of putting songs together and the art. So that was a phase of maturation. And then he became sort of the you know, celebrated Pulitzer Prize. I mean, the guy's won every, you know, prize there is to win as a storyteller. And in fact, Eternal Youth, I mean, still touring, you know, 100 dates or so a year on this thing that's called the Never Ending Tour. So you can really see how over time, these phases that Kelly Lee is talking about, you can see the embodiment of them over time. That Bob Dylan's life literally shows the evolution of the Gemini, or the maturation of the Gemini archetype, if you will, in Bob Dylan's life. And there's another person that I thought was really cool to talk about, who also has this phase, and that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was born with Mercury and Gemini as the evening star. just um, coming into visibility as evening star. Um, and you know, he was a really important literary figure in the American literary scene. In fact, Emerson really could be described as the father of the American literary scene in some ways, because he literally wrote an essay called The American Scholar, um, that was seen as a call to separate from the traditions of the old world and build our own philosophical and literary tradition here. So let's have a look at that real quick. Okay, actually, before we get to Emerson's chart, I wanna pose a question. So if we've got these like, you know, different phases of Gemini, and they, how do we know that anyone is going to make it through all of those phases? How do we know that they're going to express this more evolved state, or this, you know, or maybe they just get to the first stage of Gemini, and for them, that's all the Gemini they need, right? How can we tell that? By looking at the chart, you know, how important is the Gemini archetype? How important is it for them to really actualize the Gemini archetype, to go through all the phases like Bob Dylan did? Well, in Bob Dylan's chart, Mercury's in its own sign, and it's on an angle, and so forth. These are ways we can tell, but there's other ways also that I want to talk about. And so, for instance, right now, if we look at the chart for right now, we can see that, as I said, Mercury has entered the sky, so it's visible, and it's in this evening star phase. Now, think about this for a second. This alone, what part of the day is evening? It's the later part of the day, right? We've had morning, and everything's risen, and there was this, you know, peak of activity around noontime, and now the sun is set, and we're kind of looking back on the day, looking back on and absorbing and reflecting on the experiences, the outward experiences that we've had. So this is why classically evening sky planets, evening star planets, what are also known as you know, vespertine or occidental, are different terms that they use for planets that set after the sun. They were seen as less powerful because they take longer to develop. They're not going to be like boom. They're not going to be just, you know, necessarily right in your face from the beginning, because they, by nature, they are going to be visible in the later part of the day. So there's this process of maturation that's implied with an evening sky planet, right? So right away, if you have a planet that's in the evening sky phase, you figure, okay, this is a person who may need to grow into that archetype, right? So there's that. And then the other thing is, if you look here, by the way, if you're listening to the audio podcast, these are available on YouTube now. And so you can see the visuals that I'm referring to here. But if we look at this pink line, this is the ecliptic. And let's just go back, because this is really interesting. Mercury right now is what we call out of bounds, and Venus is also out of bounds. And what that means is that they are literally in a section of the sky that the sun, and in fact, most planets never travel in. The sun will never travel in this part of the sky. The sun stays always on the ecliptic. The sun really is the ecliptic in a visual sense, although the ecliptic technically is the orbit of the Earth around the sun. We see that as the sun going through the sky, right? So the sun reaches its maximum distance from the equator at the solstice. That's what the solstice is. It is it's the separation of the sun from the equator. When the sun crosses the equator going north, that's 0 Aries, right? And then it reaches its highest place at 0 Cancer, crosses again going south at Libra, and then reaches its furthest place south at Capricorn, right? Those are the 4 cardinal points of the year. So 0 Cancer is defined as the sun's maximum distance north of the equator. And so the sun, if it's seen as the king or queen, the sovereign, you know, then the sun defines the bounds, right? The bounds are that. And right now it's 23 degrees, 26 minutes is the maximum distance the sun. That changes over very long periods of time, and it's involved in really that is involved in cycles that determine ice ages and stuff. But for now, you know, for our lifetimes, that's the number, 23 degrees, 26 minutes. So when planets are traveling further away from the equator than the sun ever gets, they are seen to be either mavericks, rogues, you know, Robin Hood figures that are lawless, you know, depending on your point of view, brigands or heroes, right? But in this, they're out in the woods. They're traveling in this shadowy place that you know, normal people don't go. And so we've had Venus there for quite a while. And in fact, this particular loop that Venus makes every 8 years in Gemini is her absolute furthest north declination, and she gets up there for quite a while. And now Mercury is joining. So we have this this northern. We talked about this with Venus last time, about that there's 3 constellations in this part of the sky, right? We have Auriga, the charioteer, we have the bull, and we have the giant, the great hunter, Orion. We talked about how these might represent 3 different parts of the human psyche. We have this higher guidance system, right? The charioteer is the steers person who guides the ship, you know, and then the bull is the one pulling the ship, and then the hunter is kind of like, so we could think about the higher self, you know, the middle or everyday self, and then the lower self, which is like the id, you know, in Freudian terms, it's like that part of us that is the fiery driving, you know, that seeks to engage with life and to the struggle of life, you know. So we have the higher, middle, and lower self, if you will. This is a very common motif in shamanism and other worldviews, that we have these 3 selves. And we can see that reflected in the astrology right now. There's 3 different constellations in this part. And Mercury and Venus are in the upper part of that, right there. So they are calling on us to connect with this higher part of ourselves, with this higher sense of guidance, right? And usually that comes from, you know, some kind of spiritual source, you know, depending on what you're called to. You know, we could use the word God. It might be goddess for some people. It might be, for Emerson, it was nature. Nature was, he thought nature was God, essentially, or that it was a way to know God. So there's this, and now that's interesting because remember, Emerson was associated with the Transcendentalist movement. Trans meaning across, beyond, or on the other side of something. Well, in this part of the sky, Mercury is north of the ecliptic by definition, because Mercury's north node is in Taurus. So if we back this up, this is really interesting. If we back this up, we can see that visually. We can see that if we back this up to the conjunction of Mercury with the sun in Taurus, we can see that Mercury is literally crossing the ecliptic from south to north during this passage through Taurus. And in fact, just like Mercury made there was a transit of Mercury when Mercury was conjunct the Sun in Scorpio back in 2019. There was a transit of Mercury. Mercury literally went across the face of the Sun. So they were exact in both latitude and longitude. Well, the same thing happens on the backside, only we can't see Mercury across the face of the Sun because it's on the other side of the Sun. It's on the superior, meaning superius in Latin, meaning above. So there's this conjunction with the Sun on the other side, but it also happens to be there with the node. And so Mercury and the Sun are exactly aligned, but we just don't see it. But yeah, if we go back in time, we can see there's Mercury, and it's below that pink line, and then it crosses the ecliptic right with the Sun, and then it moves north as it goes into Gemini, because Taurus is the north node of Mercury. So there's this crossing into north, and because of the nature of where this is located on the ecliptic, by definition, Mercury then moves into what we call out of bounds territory. Because, and Mercury moved out of bounds, let's see, on May 16th. Because it gets to a place where this point of the 23-26, where the Sun reaches its maximum declination, Mercury is already beyond that, right? Gets into this out of bounds territory. Beginning on the 16th, joining Venus, who's been out of bounds for a while. So there's been this transcendental call from Venus for a while, and now Mercury is joining, and it's almost like Venus is handing the baton to Mercury in a way. So if Venus is our heart-centered or sort of our artistic way of knowing things, you know, there's right brain and left brain. Venus is definitely the more artistic side. She's now handing the baton to Mercury, and maybe it's a chance for us to get it with that other side of our brain, you know, and kind of bring this mind body or mind heart union. There's like a union that can happen here through this conjunction. And it's interesting because, you know, in the tarot, the card that's associated with Gemini is the Lovers, right? There's these two figures that are joining together, and it's like that that equation, 1 + 1 = 3, right? Because there's this angel above. So this union of these two opposites creates this third thing, this magical third thing. And that's what's available right now. In other words, by having these two planets that are somewhat different in nature coming together in this northern territory, this third thing, this transcendental thing, that mixing of the opposites of the fixed and volatile, the right and left brain, the heart-centered knowing and the intellectual knowing, that mixing can facilitate this transcendental connection, you see. So I just think that's really beautiful and wonderful. And, you know, I mean, most people, you know, when you hear the word trans, they're talking about, you know, transpersonal, etc. They're thinking about the outer planets, because the outer planets are transhuman, really. They revolve around the Sun in periods longer than the average human lifespan. Uranus, we're getting close to. But, you know, Neptune's like twice the average human lifespan, and Pluto's 3 times. So most people think of transpersonal in that, and transcendental in those terms. But you can see here, this is not a stretch. These planets are literally trans on the other side of the ecliptic and in a higher place, in fact, right? They're literally as high above the ecliptic as planets can get. So there's this transcendental connection. And if we move to Emerson's chart, we can see that, you know, the same thing is true there. Here we have the sun in Gemini and also Mercury in Gemini. And you can see here, here's the summer solstice point of 0 Cancer. And you can see there Mercury is quite clearly well above the ecliptic and in that northern. And in fact, what's really interesting about this, Mercury is conjunct the star Bet El Ghuz, which literally means second brightest of the giant, Bet El Ghuz. I know a lot of people like to say Beetlejuice. Great movie, but the star is Bet El Ghuz. But a very high northern star as well. So if we zoom out, we can see that if we draw a line through from Bet El Ghuz through Mercury and going north, we get to a star called Polaris of Ursa Minor. And Polaris is literally the North Star, right? So here's Ursa Minor, and here's Mercury, and there's Bet El Ghuz. So there's this very high northern star that Mercury is conjunct in Emerson's chart. And what I have found is that high latitude northern stars, they're less, like for instance, you've got Spica and Arcturus in the same degree. Many people, you can see the expression of Spica, but it's harder to discern the presence of Arcturus because it's so high. It's so, you really have to stretch and reach into that. It's transcendental, right? So here we have, and what's interesting is that, you know, Emerson essentially became the guiding star of American literature for the century in which he wrote. So there's this sort of Polaris-like quality to Emerson as a literary figure. In fact, you know, Henry David Thoreau, you know, read, you know, Nature, his treatise Nature, when, you know, he was in college and became, you know, really, and lived on Emerson's land. That was where Walden was. And so, you know, Emerson became a guiding figure in that sense too. I think Emerson actually bailed Thoreau out of jail when he was protesting the tax, you know, the famous civil disobedience deal. And Thoreau was kind of mad at him. He was like, I'm protesting, damn it. But you know, this idea that Mercury is A, out of bounds, and that's transcendental, and B, conjunct this very high northern star. There's this transcendental connection. I just think that's really interesting and really worth noting. And I think it speaks to this idea that Emerson would be a person who would be more drawn to actualizing these further developed parts of Gemini, right? He's not necessarily going to be satisfied with just being the trickster and trying to bring something new into being, which he definitely did. The Transcendentalist movement was very much a new, in fact, a lot of people link it with the Romantic movement, which is basically a reaction against the you know, it was like a, sort of this right brain, left brain thing. It was a reaction against the intellectualism of the Enlightenment and reaching into more emotional, more sensitive ways of thinking, you see? And so, yeah, he was definitely a trickster and a shapeshifter, but he also evolved into a storyteller. Emerson became a really an incredible speaker. Giving lectures was his main way of making a living. And so, and then he would either transcribe or write down those talks after he gave them, and that's became his published output. Started from being essentially like a storyteller, you see. So yeah, and you know what's interesting about, so you say, well, Mercury and Gemini, what does that have to do with nature? Shouldn't that be an earth sign? Well, Emerson had Saturn in Virgo, and Jupiter and Saturn in Virgo. He was born at a time when Jupiter and Saturn had just made a conjunction. And remember, for a very long time, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were happening in earth signs. So there's an interesting part of it. And I just want to read a little bit from what from that essay for people who may not be familiar with it, because I think it has an interesting thing to do with where we're at. Because he starts out the thing talking about solitude, and what's interesting is right now the common experience of people worldwide is this quarantine, right? And being, you know, isolated and stuff. And so Emerson starts out talking about solitude, and he says, to go into solitude, a person needs to retire as much from their chamber as from society. I am not solitary while I read and write, though no one is with me. Now think about that for a second. What he's saying is that we carry society with us. You know, right there, my bookshelf, that's society, right? That's all these collected words of all these people whispering into my head. But when I get out in nature, I'm truly separated from that. You see, that's what he's saying, that, you know, when you're reading and writing, you're still functioning as a social being. Okay. But when you get out in nature, you're able to transcend that. You're able to get beyond that. And in fact, this other essay that I was talking about, where the American scholar, Emerson thought that the goal of the writer or the thinker is to become, is to get beyond the socialized, the social, you know, limits of thinking, right? What we now today would call the echo chamber, right? Where, you know, everybody's talking about this, everybody's talking about that, and all the stuff that everybody's talking about, that's here. Emerson was saying to really think, you have to get beyond that. You have to step into an area where you're thinking for yourself. This higher state of mind, to become, rather than to become a person thinking, you become humanity thinking. You become a channel for something larger, that is humanity thinking. It's not you thinking, it's not society thinking, it's humanity thinking, right? So there's that higher, you know, self that we were talking about. Emerson said that to do that, we have to throw off this the chains. He says that we're victims of society, and so we have to throw off, and that, you know, so this becoming one with this higher way of thinking is really the aim of the true scholar. And so, you know, it's very interesting that, you know, again, he had this Mercury and Gemini, it's out of bounds, and it's conjunct this very high northern star. So he's saying, you got to get out of society, you got to get out of your house, you got to get away from all that before you can have this purity available to you, where you can become humanity thinking. I mean, that's really profound, you know? And so the danger is that you could be quarantined and never really alone, never really separate from all that noise, all of that social influence, all of that, right? You could be alone but not free, essentially. See? And yeah, what a tragedy that would be, right? That there's this wonderful, I mean, yeah, it's wonderful. Well, there's this situation where we're forced into not being able to do all this stuff. The only silver lining of it is, hey, maybe we could actually get to think for ourselves for once, for a change. And to miss that, would definitely be a tragedy in my mind. And so I think that's part of what this Mercury Venus conjunction is about, is that because I think that, I mean, I can hear it in people's voices. I can hear even people who aren't necessarily scholars, I can hear them talking and I can hear them saying things like, wow, this is different and there's something else out there. And like, why wasn't I doing this all along? You know? Well, there you go. Sometimes it takes events force us into a place where we can be somewhere that we couldn't otherwise, and seizing that moment and seizing that opportunity is what it's about. So to go on here, yeah, I'm not solitary while I read and write, though no one is with me. But if a person would be alone, let them look at the stars. There it is. It's the third sentence in this treatise that made him famous. Look at the stars. The rays that come from these heavenly worlds will separate them and what they touch. One might think that the atmosphere was made transparent with this design. In other words, this transcendental design to give humans in the heavenly bodies the perpetual presence of the sublime. And he goes on to talk about if only the stars only came out once in a while, we would be more likely to appreciate them, which is interesting because right now I'm in the Smokies and we're socked in for like a week. And it's so true because though I was out last week and got to see Mercury for myself, and that was awesome, I wasn't able to get a photograph because it was just, it was fleeting and whatnot. And so I've been wanting to catch a photograph of Mercury for everybody, and I can't do it right now. And so, yeah. And also, the parkway was closed down for a while and I couldn't get up there. And yeah, the fair people were like, oh, what are you going to do when the quarantine's lifted? This and that. I'm like, I'm going to the parkway, man. So I think that's really funny. But he says, yeah, the stars awaken a certain reverence because though always present, they are inaccessible. And then he says, but all natural objects make a kindred impression when the mind is open to their influence. In other words, all of nature has this ineffable, inaccessible quality. And that when we're in nature, we can stargaze even by looking at a flower, for instance. And I've been doing that a lot lately too. In fact, alchemy was always called terrestrial astronomy. It's like the same thing, on Earth, you see? And Emerson goes on to talk about this idea that that being in nature, there's this transcendental thing available. But again, the idea is that when I'm in my study, I'm not alone, even though no one else is present. The other tragedy would be to go out in nature and still be carrying your cell phone with you, right? Blah, 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 talking on the cell phone or talking in your head and never really leaving behind all that crap, you know. And he says, to speak truly, few adults can see nature. Most persons do not see the sun. At least they have only a very superficial seeing. The sun illuminates only the eye of the human, but it shines into the eye and the heart of the child. You see, so seeing not just with our eyes, but with our heart. This deeper seeing is what makes it transcendental. The lover of nature are they whose inward and outward senses are still truly adjusted to each other. They have retained the spirit of infancy even into the era of adulthood. Their intercourse with heaven and earth becomes part of their daily food. Wow, so there's this nurturing, this sustenance, this energy that we can receive from the stars, and from the plants, and from nature. It's the source of energy, of sustenance, just like food. Wow, right? I mean, yeah. And that's always been the way for me. Nature was always my first love. Before any woman, I mean, I loved nature and I loved the sky. And I can't do without it, you know. And that's what makes me, I think that's what makes me the kind of astrologer that I am, is that I'm an astrophile. I love the sky. Okay, one more thing, because remember how Kelly Lee showed that the cycle goes around to the eternal youth in Gemini? So here Emerson says, in the woods, a person casts off their years as the snake its skin, and what period soever of life is always a child. In the woods is perpetual youth. So there you go. There's the eternal youth of Gemini. So I just thought it was really striking that the way that Kelly Lee talks about the Gemini archetype evolving, and this idea of this transcendental connection that Emerson talks about with nature, and the ultimate goal of that is this perpetual youth. And to be clear, I don't think he's talking about eternal youth as in, like, you know, physical vitality, although there is some of that. I think he means like this idea of this carefree blank slate, this tabula rasa, where your mind is not crowded with all this stuff that society stuffs in there, right? You're not a consumer. You're not this hole to be stuffed with goods. You're a free individual. You're free to write on that tablet what you wish. You see? That's eternal youth. Okay, so let's go back to the astronomy program here. And I want to show you a little bit about what's going on in the sky. So yeah, if you're, you know, here on the East Coast, there's a tropical storm blowing through. So we've been socked in with rain for a few days, and I think it's supposed to last a few days more. But if it's clear where you are, there's this wonderful opportunity to see Mercury. Not very many people have seen Mercury, you know. The other planets are much more common to see. Right now, all you need to go out, and Venus you can't miss, and you just look below Venus in the direction where the sun set, and you can find Mercury, which is pretty cool in and of itself. And as I said, there's this opportunity for this transcendental window to open up from that experience. And I don't think, you know, it's not like you have to like say the right words, or if you want to say a prayer, or if you want to ask for something, I mean, obviously that's great. If you want to, you know, just talk to them like a friend, like a confidant, that's another really great thing. But just being there and witnessing it, I think, is enough. So if you're able to do that, that's wonderful. And then if you watch over the weekend, you can see something really interesting, because just like Mercury recently crossed its north node and is moving into north latitude out of bounds, the moon is going to enter the sky a little bit to the left, which is south of Mercury, and then it's going to cross the ecliptic as it passes by Mercury and Venus, because the moon's north node is right now at the solstice point. You see, so there's this very interesting opportunity to watch the moon crossing its node. On May 23rd, the moon, Venus, and Mercury will all be together, and they'll all be right there with Capella, by the way, which is a really interesting magical star that's supposed to be very medicinal. So I'm going to be taking the next step with my mushroom tinctures. I've already got a reishi tincture. I'm working on a chaga tincture, and I'm going to be doing another batch of those two and putting them together over this. And I'm going to take the next step with that as Mercury, Venus, and the moon come together right there with Capella. I can show you the chart for that. I think the morning actually would be the best in terms of talisman type. You've got Capella rising at 22 degrees of Gemini on the morning of May 23rd, and the moon is applying to a conjunction with that. So that's the one I'm going to be using if you're interested in. Yeah, the moon is applying to a retrograde planet, and that's not always great, but fortune is there with the moon and Mercury. And so I think that helps quite a bit. Fortune is the lot of the moon, so fortune can stand in for the moon when the moon has trouble delivering her natural significations. So there's the moon, and you'll notice that the moon is not just below in terms of altitude, in terms of distance from the horizon, but it's below in terms of the ecliptic. It's on the south side of the ecliptic. And then if you watch the next day, the moon is on the ecliptic, and then the next day above the ecliptic. So you can literally see the moon crossing the ecliptic Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and Mercury passing by Venus. And so I hope that people get a chance to get out there and experience this transcendental activity of looking at the stars, and see this wonderful little astronomy lesson that's happening in the sky. And then, of course, Mercury will be conjunct Polaris a few days later. And then, you know, what's interesting about this, I was thinking, I saw this last fall. I saw this lady who was making this jewelry from, it's called precious metal clay. You like carve the thing into the clay, and then you put the clay in the oven, and it burns away the clay and just leaves the precious metal, like silver or the brass or whatever. And she had these symbols. It's called Vegvisir, I guess. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but it comes from Veger, meaning the way, and Visir, meaning to point. So it points the way. It's this talisman or sigil from the Icelandic Norse tradition. And it's supposed to keep you from getting lost. And I thought, wow, wouldn't that be cool to carve that into something, you know, when there's as a talisman for Polaris, you know? And, you know, I just had the thought, and then, you know, I actually went to the trouble of drawing up an election for Polaris. You can see that here. Polaris is at 2850. So what you want is the moon applying to the star, and not having any applying conjunctions or oppositions. So the moon's past the square to Neptune. Mercury is too by this time. The ruler of the ascendant is Mercury, who's in its own sign and in in the 10th house. It looks like a pretty good opportunity for a Polaris talisman. It's not something you'll find in the books, but given that, you know, Emerson had Mercury conjunct Polaris and ended up becoming this guiding force. And I think a Polaris talisman would work. I think it'd be a pretty cool thing to have. So I just wanted to share that with you. This is something that I didn't actually end up putting in my monthly report that goes out to my members. And I don't think I put that Capella one in there either, but these kinds of things are stuff that I share with my members every month. They get a report with different magical opportunities. So here's a couple that I shared with y'all that weren't in there. But if you want to get the report for the other magical opportunities, you can find out more about that on my website, dreamastrologer.com, particularly on the special offers page. So yeah, Vegvisir, this way shower, this Norse talisman sigil thing. I'm pretty excited about that. That's combining that with Polaris, I think would be a really cool deal. And the other thing that I recommend for people to do is to meditate on this idea that Kelly Lee gave us about these different phases of the Gemini archetype. Because to be clear, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. The trickster has to come along and sort of introduce this new idea in the first place before you can ever have the later stages, right? So it's as necessary, as vital, as important as any of the other stages. It's not less than. It's just earlier, maybe, or But to sort of meditate on where you are with the Gemini archetype. And what's interesting is that Kelly Lee goes on to say, that after you've experienced all of these, after you've developed all of these parts of the archetype, then basically you're free to choose at any time which one is the appropriate one. I've got this new idea. I've got to introduce it to people in a way they're going to be able to absorb it, right? That's the trickster. That's, you have to be able to, and so just like when Hermes, he invented the lyre, the stringed instrument, and then seduced his brother Apollo by singing with it into accepting him as an equal. Said, well, I'll trade you the lyre, and since I stole your cattle, now we're even, right? But since we're even, then we're equal, you see? So he kind of he stole his way into the pantheon. And that's what you got to do when you're introducing something new. You got to kind of steal it in there. But if you're past that stage, maybe you need to learn how to shapeshift with it. Maybe you need to learn how to say, okay, I've introduced this thing. What's another way I can tell people about it? Because I've been telling them this one way, and some people are getting it, but not as many as I'd like. So what's another way I can present it? How can I, change as a teacher, right? When I was an English teacher, you do this by using different mediums, right? It's the same basic lesson, but now you're doing it with crayons and paper instead of, right? And so you have different mediums. You have different some people are auditory learners, some people are visual learners, right? So you change the medium, and then you develop it into kind of a business. Okay, I've got this new thing, people are cool about it. Hey, I've become a patron, right? And I can develop it even further, right? So there's that. And then you become this sort of this storyteller, and then eventually the eternal youth. But the point is that by going through this experience, there's a spiral of evolution, but then you can learn, then you can pick and choose from which one is necessary right now, which one is necessary for this particular situation. right? And then you get to pick and choose. So a couple things you could you know, am I in need of the trickster? Am I in need of the shapeshifter? Am I in need of um, the messenger merchant? Am I in need of the storyteller? You know, do I need some of that eternal youth that Emerson talked about that's available in nature? Um, where am I in this overall thing? And then, yeah, how can I take any one of these 5 facets of Gemini and apply them to any given situation? I just think this is an incredible lesson, and I'm so happy that Brenda agreed to share it with the world, because I know that Kelly, I mean, this was, you know, really his transcendental moment. This was a genius idea that he came up with, and so I'm really happy to share it with people. And I hope that y'all will also check out his Jupiter Saturn book that he wrote. I'll put some links in the YouTube video for that. But he also wrote this ebook on the Jupiter Saturn conjunction cycle. That's really incredible. So check that out as well. And I guess that's it for this time. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I wish you bright blessings of the transcendental pairing of Venus and Mercury out of bounds in Gemini. Until next time.